And we are back on the Zero Hour. Our next guest is an expert in the field of financial machinations and how they affect the real world, as well as economics in general. Mike Konczal is a fellow with the Roosevelt Institute, where he works on financial reform, unemployment issues, inequality, and a progressive vision of the economy. And he joins us now. Mike, good to have you on the program.
Thanks for having me back.
You bet. It's always a pleasure, and you've been doing some great work lately, so I really wanted to talk to you about it. Now, you guys put out a report on financialization, defining financialization, and I thought this was a great piece of work for several reasons, but one of which is that for those of us who kind of work and write and advocate in this financially related fields, the intersection of finance and politics, I guess you could say, and finance and policy. Financialization is a term that gets used a lot, but the definition has not always been precise, even though the principle is so important. So I thought it was great of you to try to nail it down. So tell us, if you would, briefly, what you concluded in terms of what is financialization.
Sure. So we define it as the increased prevalence of finance in the economy as a whole, and control over the rest of the economy and the control over our productive assets, an increased regulatory framework that benefits wealth at the expense of other people, and the increasing view of finance as a kind of defining goal of our society, or just the way we view society. So it's essentially, finance is an increase in our savings, and just like the way it works is part of channeling savings and power over society in the formation of wealth, and then in society as a whole, just viewing things through a financial lens. Another way to do it, and I think this might be a little bit easier because that sounds a little convoluted, just even trying to simplify it, is what kind of problem is the financial sector? What kind of problem is finance for society? And I think we have a pretty good sense that it's wasteful, that it rips a lot of people off, it plunders black wealth, it destroys communities through foreclosures, through predatory lending, and also kind of causes these boom and bust cycles that involve a lot of huge recessions, huge problems. But it's also a problem in the way it orientates society towards financial claims, away from investment, away from full employment, and away from more socially defined goods, and towards trying to always push things into a cash nexus, always trying to think of short term, always trying to think of things and making them sellable assets.
I think you touched on a couple important things there, Mike Konczal. I want to talk about them. First of all, let's define the financial sector as being, feel free to disagree, but being that portion of the private economy that earns wealth or accumulates wealth through the manipulation of funds. Fair enough definition, through the manipulation of money, as opposed to the production and selling of goods or services.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's essentially people who are trying to intermediate funds, people who also do other things like provide payment services, credit cards, debit cards, and there's a lot of battles about that. There's been a lot of reforms and a lot of lack of reforms. There's been the creation of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in the aftermath of the crisis, which has done a lot of great work. There hasn't been things like breaking up the banks or reinstating Glass-Steagall, or more fundamental shifts in finance that leave people very worried that the old system's fundamentally in place. And there's a lot of energy there, and it's a lot of interest. And what I want to do is kind of expand that outward and think, well, it's not just that finance does that. Finance also, for instance, dictates how CEOs can run their companies, or how cities can have schools or roads. And that increase in powers is a real new characteristic.
Yeah, and I think this is a very important part of this conversation, to think about how the financial sector, or finance, is really pervasively influencing many other sectors and areas of society. We're talking with Mike Konczal from the Roosevelt Institute, and one of the things I've said that may only be partially hyperbolic is that, in a sense, every CEO in every industry is a financier nowadays. If the corporation is publicly traded, they are thinking in financial terms about how the stock market reacts to their announcements and their decisions. about quarterly earnings as opposed to the old image of a guy who there are exceptions, of course, but many CEOs in industrial and other types of corporations are managing for the financial sector rather than for the sector they're supposedly in. And that, to me, I don't, A, if you agree, it would be question number one, but then B, wouldn't that be, to the extent it's true, one example of the kind of financialization you're talking about?
Absolutely. What you're seeing increasingly is CEOs are coming from the financial sector, and they're moving across industry. They move across industries rather than up through industries. So CEOs a few generations ago would be someone who intimately knew the industry that they were in, whether it was manufacturing or textiles or computers or services. Now they tend to be kind of a more disposable class that has much shorter tenure. They bounce around a lot more often, and they're often much more affiliated with or come through the financial industry. So they think in terms of, how do I turn this business into something I can get money? So I think a phrase I really like is that a few generations ago, finance was much more about getting money into companies, and now finance is a lot more about getting money out of companies. And when you look at dividends and buybacks, they're essentially money leaving the firm instead of being used for investments or wages. It's now roughly about 100% of corporate profits, which is both disturbing in and of itself and also particularly problematic in the Great Recession when corporate profits are very high but investments and wages are very low. And that's just a reorientation of the way firms work that wasn't there in the mid-century period, and it seems to be off the radar for a lot of people who are thinking about the economy right now.
And one example, since I've concentrated at various points myself on healthcare, let's say, one of the examples that comes to mind is CVS and other pharmacy chains, and also physician practice management companies and hospitals and other healthcare providers. There are cases where, let's say, a pharmacy has been taken over and acquired through Bain Capital or someone like that, goes deeply into debt as part of that process. So the new owners come in, take over with a lot of debt to pay, plus maybe millions in consulting fees to the firm that arranged the takeover. And then they're under very aggressive profit maximization schedules in order to make these various, in order to deal with this leveraging. And therefore the temptation is to engage in massive layoffs to improve margins, even though that overworks workers and adds to unemployment and has an impact on the quality of service being delivered. So there's that, the expense reduction side. And then B, you've had cases, for example, where pharmacy chain executives have submitted to temptation, given into temptation, I would say, and defrauded Medicare, for example. So I think there is a structural harm that's done, whether it's to the delivery of services, in the examples I gave, to the health care of the public, to the employment prospects, job security, wages, and so on. Isn't that another example of the way this financialization is kind of corroding from within a lot of our corporations?
Yeah, and it's actually really disturbing, right? How much of the financial darlings in the economy at any moment, be it the tech stocks of the late 90s, Enron, WorldCom, the for-profit education sector in the mid-2000s and going into the Great Recession, things that were really dictated by the values of finance and were often, if not created by finance, where finance was very involved in the beginning as opposed to a different kind of business that might go to finance later. Those companies all turned out to be huge, fraudulent, corrupt enterprises that, and also crucially, imploded the moment that all the money was taken out. Same thing with MBS, mortgage-backed securities, and a lot of the instruments that went with this private label, with the housing bubble.
Well, then
that's really telling, right? Because it means that
right.
the values of the sectors are not about long-term growth. They're not about prosperity or innovation. They're about how can we get money out the door without our fingerprints on it. I
have this mental image, and you tell me if it's off base, but whenever I start talking, I think I even made a graphic about this one. Whenever I start talking about financialization, I think of those giant flying saucers in Independence Day that remember they learned they go from planet to planet and they just suck everything out of every possible resource out of the planet and leave this sort of smoking hulk, and then they go on to the next planet. I mean, it's a little excessive, I grant you, but Mike Konczal, isn't there something that said, aren't you really saying that it creates the wrong incentives and it's gaining too much influence economically and politically?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's obviously there are. I mean, when you look at a lot of neighborhoods that got a lot of money from mortgages through the mortgage-backed security market and this kind of Wall Street way of creating markets. I mean, I don't think it's an exaggeration at all when you see the devastation that has been done to so many of our communities from a Wall Street-led housing bubble. That's it seems hyperbolic, or it seems like hyperbole, but then you think of specific examples, and it's crazy. And we can push back on too big to fail. We can push back on a lot of the market manipulation, the things like the way Wall Street has manipulated international interest rates with LIBOR or the foreign exchange markets, and we can push for criminal convictions or harder fines or fundamental change there, and that's essential work. And people like us and people like our friends out there are trying very hard on that. But combating some of these other ways finance reorganizes the economy scares me because I think it's very difficult. Now, on the other hand, though, it wasn't always this way, and it was a specific project carried out by finance, by intellectuals, by conservatives in the and neoliberals in the 70s and the 80s. And there's a lot of energy that goes into keeping it going. So it almost tells us how unnatural it is for everything to be dictated by finance's terms. And it does say that there's a way to push back against that.
Well, and I want to talk about that. Mike Konczal is a fellow with the Roosevelt Institute, and he's just written a new paper, relatively recent paper, on defining financialization. I think that part of the ideology and part of the sales job of the financial sector and the intellectual allies that are driving this is the notion that this is just inevitable. This is the way capital works. This is the way money works. And this is economics. And submit, basically, you will be assimilated. And I think it's very important to say and reiterate what you just said, which is that this is by no means inevitable. This was done consciously through an intellectual assault, a communications strategy, certainly a political strategy, and very coordinated. And as you say, there's a lot of people kind of working hard to keep this thing afloat. So what would be some well, I'll save that question. There's so much I could talk to you about with this on this topic, Mike, but let's stick with this for a second. What would some of the concrete things be that people could do that we as a society and as a government of elected officials supposedly representing us, what could we do to reverse this process of financialization?
Right. So, I mean, there's technical changes you can make. You can, pass some regulations or tighten up other things. But fundamentally, and those are good ideas, and there's tons of them. There's some in the report, and there's some elsewhere. But fundamentally, if you're thinking about an imbalance in power, it's also what you also have to do is empower other agents relative to finance, because finance is very clever and is very good about getting around rules, and also rules are essentially, you're trying to put up a dam against a flood. You need to target it in a different way or redirect it or make something that's stronger than it. And so things that I look at is how do you empower workers broadly in the economy? You can imagine situations where we put workers on boards. Mm-hmm. That would be, other countries do it.
Absolutely.
That kind of that co-determination, I think, also, people argue whether or not that would really help outside a larger labor movement, but certainly I think just reorientating the firm towards the idea that the workers have to vote and put someone on the board, I think is a very powerful statement and can make a big difference. There's things about how to empower long-term shareholders relative to short-term shareholders or board members relative to shareholders. I think whatever you thought about what went wrong in the 1970s, the pendulum has swung way too far in the direction of shareholder power and the shareholder revolution. And I think the ways of trying to rejigger and rethink through that, I think, is just really essential. cities. I think the way, we didn't even get a good chance to talk about it, but the way finance is plundering a lot of these city budgets with a lot of really dubious financial instruments or high fees. My colleague Sakibati just wrote a really great piece, cover story in these Times, talking about the way cities need to band together and essentially help negotiate better fees for all other cities, because New York, LA, and Chicago have huge funds that they can use to dictate terms, and then they can kind of bring in other cities with it or come up with better practices than the way finance right now is almost like a kind of a crony operation with giving really bad terms and really bad contracts to municipalities. I think thinking in terms of that, what's not what is the one fix that will fix this, but instead of how do we rebalance power so other people can keep finance in check, I think is really going to be the challenge in the next decade.
And parenthetically, when we're talking about cities, Mike Konczal, I think the other dimension of it that we forget is everybody's talking about cutting pensions for city workers. Nobody's talking about the enormous fees that have been paid to the financial sector by our cities, in many cases for fairly poor results. Somehow that's escaped the debate, right?
Yeah, and a lot of the when you get these kind of bespoke instruments, you have these huge prepayment penalties.
Right.
It gives. It's almost like they get terms like a random person off the street would get instead of like a major city that controls a lot of resources. There's a lot of debate about why and how this happens, but it's crucial that these instruments become better, because cities do need to borrow money, but they don't need to borrow the most complicated derivative that they can find that they're often sold to. And enforcing simple things like fiduciary standards, enforcing simple obligations on the financial sector can go a huge way in rebalancing that nature.
Absolutely. And last question, ultimately underpinning all of this, Mike, I think we also, and curious your closing thoughts on this, I think we need a kind of cultural shift. I think we need to rethink the way we as a society talk about money and the financial sector. And it seems that we've almost adopted a submissive attitude towards it, and that we really need to think more in terms of being a citizenry that is in charge of its own destiny rather than subject to the whims and caprices of the financial sector. I mean, closing thoughts on that. Any?
Yeah, absolutely. And we talk about it in the report. We're not cultural critics, but we try to talk a little bit about this change in the way we view society and the way we view everything as a financial asset, and the city is a bunch of things you can privatize or rent out instead of a collective good or a social good, or our educations are these investments in human capital, and I think one thing that does is it sets people up to fail, right? Because it's very difficult for individuals to be these brilliant risk managers and entrepreneurs. It's actually very difficult for finance to do it, professionals to do it. Individuals have a hard time, which is reasons why we've evolved things like Social Security instead of just 401ks. And I think that kind of view of viewing yourself as this miniature entrepreneur who's, ultimately under the, global capital and recessions, like you have very little control over the way the real economy works. It sets people up for cynicism and desperation, and I think it causes a lot of the apathy we see right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And Mike, there was so much we didn't talk about that I wanted to talk about, including student loans, but we're just going to have you back. Mike Konczal is a fellow with the Roosevelt Institute, and Mike, as always, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, man.
You bet.